This is Mae Brussell. It is tape 854, April the 18th, 1988. Last week I suggested that you send your subscription renewals to me here at the house so that I can become familiar with the new subscribers, but I'm going to change that back again. I can get a list of subscribers from Betty Phillips at the Tape Center and from Al Kunzer. So do as you've been doing before. Send your renewals and your subscriptions to those two people, and I can get the list from them of the people who are taking the tapes. I've been talking previously on one or two broadcasts about the murder of an Indian in Lumberton County, North Carolina, a situation where Julian Pierce was about to get an appointment as a judicial candidate. It's a very controversial area there with a lot of racism and problems with Indians and blacks as well. Two men were arrested for the murder of Mr. Pierce. One was Sandy Chavez, C-H-A-V-I-S, a Lumbee Indian, was arrested with a murder warrant out for him, and another, John Anderson Goins, G-O-I-N-S. And Mr. Chavez testified or told the powers that be in a confession. He didn't confess his own self doing the murder. He said that Mr. Goins pulled the trigger on the shotgun that killed Mr. Pierce. And, of course, it was Mr. Goins who was found dead in a cell, and that case, I suppose, is now closed. Mr. Goins, it turns out, was a security guard in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it reminded me of SLEAZE, the security guard who pulled the gun from behind the back of Robert Kennedy, and Sirhan took the penalty for the fatal bullet that killed Robert Kennedy. So the person who had shot Mr. Pierce, according to one of the two parties, was a security guard. The reason I bring this up again, and many of you might have seen these instances of quick deaths, such as Lee Harvey Oswald, or this particular Mr. Goins being dead as soon as he's fingered as the person who did the murder, but the political implications follow the same pattern also and are very significant. In the New York Times, there was just a brief article. Opponent of slain candidate declares himself the winner. That's very easy to do when the other person is dead. A judgeship candidate whose rival was slain last week asked the governor, James Martin, not to call a special legislative session that would allow a candidate from a minority group to enter the race. That's about as clear as you can get it for a motive to kill somebody in a very dangerous area where Indians and blacks are not wanted. The governor met with the district attorney, Joe Freeman Britt, who declared himself the rightful Democratic nominee for Superior Court judge in the racially troubled Robeson County. And he will win the judgeship in November since no Republican is seeking the seat. And he told the governor, don't allow any other candidate from a minority group to enter. So therefore the case is all sealed and set, and the judgeship will go to another probably controversial white judge, and the man who possibly shot this candidate is dead himself. Case closed, and goodness knows what kind of justice will take place in that town in North Carolina. Now there's a big change happening through our Democratic Party, through the Democratic Party, not ours, you may be Republicans, that is going to affect the way the Congress looks next year. And I wonder if you're adding it up. Maybe you are, maybe you are not. I thought I'd go over it with you. The New York Times had a long article on Joe Biden. This was dated February 27, 1988, how Mr. Biden for several months had a silent time bomb in his head that almost killed him, that he suffered from neck pain that they believed was a viral infection. And this article goes on with the importance of chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who started wearing a brace in January during the hearings on the nomination of Anthony Kennedy. Now, while he was listening and defeating the nomination of Robert Bork, he wasn't wearing a neck brace and his neck didn't hurt. His neck only hurt when he defeated Bork very loud and clearly, and after that he had this aneurysm that has kept him silent so far. There's only been a picture of him. He's had 2 surgeries, and Joe Biden went into a smaller hospital, Wilmington, Delaware Hospital, for tests, and within hours he was taken to the Army Hospital, Walter Reed Army Hospital, where he had a 6-hour operation. And as I say, we haven't seen or heard a word about Joe Biden since his 2 surgeries. Now, Senator Robert Byrd spoke up just last week and referred to Attorney General Meese as the king of sleaze. And within a week, less than a week's time, Robert Byrd announced that he's giving up his important leadership in the Democratic Party as the Speaker for the Senate, the Democratic leader for the Senate. And I wonder if somebody got to him. He was attacking the king of sleaze. Of course, Larry Speakes had to resign from Merrill Lynch as soon as he revealed tales that he wrote press releases for President Ronald Reagan. But Meese is a holy cow in Washington, it seems, and Senator Byrd quickly gave up his important position after talking about the Attorney General. Representative Edward Boland, Democrat, the author of the Boland Amendment, who was instrumental in stopping arms to the Contras after the mining of the harbor, announced that he is retiring from Congress. So we have Meese as the person attacked by Byrd. Byrd won't be in Congress next year. Representative Edward Boland is also resigning, and he played a major role in turning the events around in Nicaragua. Democratic Peter Rodino of New Jersey is not seeking election again. He was responsible for the Office of Immigration that returned the facts about Nazis in this country, war criminals in this country, and was an important factor in deporting some Nazis out of the United States. Patrick Buchanan was working hard to keep those Nazis in the United States. Of course, he loves Edwin Meese, too. So Peter Rodino will not be in Congress next year. William Proxmire is leaving the Congress. He was the watchdog on the Pentagon money waste in the Pentagon. So the man who attacked Robert Ford is very ill and has a chance of another blood clot at any time, making him drop dead. Rodino, who was watching the Nazis in the United States, won't be there. Boland, who was watching the arms go to the Contras, won't be there. Robert Byrd will give up his mouthpiece as spokesman for the Democrats in the Senate, and Proxmire, who watched the Pentagon waste, will not be there. Those are big changes that have been announced just in the past 2 weeks. The Wall Street Journal had an article that has as much arrogance as many that I've seen, than I've seen in a long, long time, April 13th, this past week. It's about the Tri-Lateral Commission meeting in Japan, and it's written by Robert Bartley, a member of the Tri-Lateral Commission. The title is Trilateral Diary on the Usefulness of Establishments. And this article goes along with the broadcast and material I've done on how policies are made 20 years in advance, that a team such as Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Fred Ickley write down what the next president has to do, whether he's a Democrat or Republican. In this article, it goes along those lines. The article is about the meeting in Japan, and the Trilateral Commission, he explains, was founded 15 years ago to add Japan to the European North American economic political dialogue, to include them. And now some fear there'd be the economic overlord of even the United States. And this article tells, back in New Hampshire, Republican primary in 1980, the late publisher, William Loeb, turned his unique talents to making a boogeyman out of the innocuous Trilateral Commission. George Bush, the principal opponent of Loeb's favorite, Ronald Reagan, was a trilateralist, and of course he's part of the Order of the Skull and Crossbones and a trilateralist, and will hopefully be the president of the United States on the Republican ticket. Bush is a trilateralist. Loeb didn't like them at the time, and this author said it, but Jimmy Carter, who didn't know anyone else outside of Georgia, staffed his high-end foreign policy with trilateralists, and right-wing ones at that, such as Zbigniew Brzezinski and Harold Brown. And he also then used Caspar Weinberger. Ronald Reagan used Caspar Weinberger, who's a member of the Trilateral Commission, as soon as Reagan was president. And the article says, a later make-up meeting between President Reagan and Mr. Rockefeller never erased the image, no doubt partly because of the editorials branding the 1980 episode as nonsense at a time, And this editor who's writing this story attended some of these meetings where the confrontation came up between Rockefeller and Reagan. And the important thing about this, many important things, is that Nelson Rockefeller is not alive, and Ronald Reagan is the president. Weinberger of the Trilateral was on his cabinet. Then the article continues about the successfulness of Japan, the part of the Trilateral Commission, who at this time could sell the Imperial Palace in Tokyo and would have enough money to buy California. Right now they have enough cash to buy almost all of our banks. But the conclusion of the article goes this way. For Mr. Rockefeller, he saw 15 years ago that the world is becoming one economy, transcending political sovereignties. Somehow institutions, indeed establishments, need to be developed to cope with this reality. Institutions, let me say this again from Robert Bartley, a trilateralist and a writer-editor for the Wall Street Journal. He said our institutions and establishments have to cope with the reality that the world is one economy and it transcends political sovereignties. If the next U.S. president is Mr. Bush, a trilateralist, it will be good because he has his foot in both the Trilateral Commission and the Reagan camps. Or if the next president is another callow governor with no world experience, it will not be good if he must fill his post with strangers or natives of one state, especially the state of Massachusetts. What Robert Bartley is saying, that when if Dukakis were to become president, he would have to take a cabinet from the Trilateral Commission, identical to what Jimmy Carter did, because the Trilateralists recognize that the world is one economy transcending political sovereignties, and that you need the institutions and establishments to develop this reality. This is their reality. The title of the article is Trilateral Diary on the Usefulness of Establishments, and that the new president, if he just happens to be a Democrat, has to face the reality of the world. Now, some of you might remember the words of Patty Chayefsky, an author who had an untimely early death, who wrote Network. It was a movie, came out in a book in 1976, and if you remember, the television gentleman there was taken into a hall similar to, they referred to Valhalla, and he was told to sit down. Mr. Howard was told to sit down, and he was in front of a screen, a lectern screen, where he was to get a lecture from Mr. Jensen. And Mr. Jensen said to him, in quotes, "You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale. I won't have it." He says, "I won't have it. Is that clear? You think you have merely stopped a business deal, and that's not the case. The Arabs have taken billions out of this country, and now they must put it back," which is similar to Japan putting things back in this country. He said, "It's ebb and flow, it's tidal gravity, it's ecological balance. You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and people. There are no nations, there are no people, there are no Russians, no Arabs, no third world. There is no West. There is one holistic system of systems, one vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational domination of dollars, petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars," and he goes on. He said that is the natural order of things today. And I've quoted this on other broadcasts earlier in the past years. It's so important, but it comes up again in the Wall Street Journal today. And he goes on to saying to Mr. Beale, that is the atomic, subatomic, galactic structure of things today, and you have meddled with the primal forces of nature, and you will atone. Am I getting through to you, Mr. Beale? And being as Mr. Beale is Patty Chayefsky, and Patty Chayefsky is dead, he does indeed atone. And then he says, you get up on your little 21-inch screen, Mr. Beale, and you will howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM, ITT, ATT, DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. These are the nations of the world. Now, what do you think of that? What do you think the Russians talk about? We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been that way since it crawled out of the slime, and our children will live to see the perfect world where there's no war, famine, or oppression, and so forth. He said, where there's a vast ecumenical holding company for whom all men will work to serve a common share of stock. All their necessities will be provided, and all their anxieties tranquilized. And, of course, you know the methods of tranquilization that will be used. Now, getting away from Wall Street Journal and the determination and blatant statement of what kind of a cabinet Mr. Dukakis will take. He doesn't even refer to Jesse Jackson as if he has a chance. I want to continue with a subject I briefly mentioned when I talked about the king of sleaze. That was Edwin Meese, and the fact that Howard Bender family that paid Ursula Meese $40,000 a year for the next 3 years was receiving $7.1 million from U.S. taxes and the Justice Department for the rental of their offices. But the story got to be even worse in the past week, and I want to summarize it for you. I know most of you have seen articles on the scandal of the Justice Department renting a building from the Bender family and what happened, the convoluted context of this case, but I want to put in chronological order because it is so horrendous. First of all, there's this E. Robert Wallach, who plays a part in this selection of meeting people. The Benders and the Meeses friendship goes way back, but one article said that George Walker, the attorney for E. Robert Wallach's matters, said that Wallach did play a peripheral role in Mrs. Meese's job with the Multiple Sclerosis Society. They got their foot into that door. In the fall of 1985, the Bender Foundation said it would give $120,000 to the MS Society. Mr. Bender's wife, Sandra, was a board member, and if they put Mrs. Meese, who was a volunteer, on the payroll, $40,000 annually, they would give the society $120,000. So Mr. Robert Wallach played a role some way in getting her the job with the MS Society. First, they were going to get her with a radio station and settled for this one, but I guess he was the scout and fixer for a job that Mrs. Meese could have. Now, in 1984, the government gave notice that they were going to move the immigration services to new quarters, and Congress approved the specific order and went through the plans for the move, in which 63% of what was leased at that time would not be used by the Justice Department. In March 1985, the Chester Arthur building was bought by the Bender family for $37.5 million, and they paid twice the assessed value for some reason or other, but at this time the Justice Department lease was about to expire. June of 1985, 3 months after they bought the building, there were complaints that workers there were getting sick. The Benders promised to correct the problem. It came from the air circulation system. June 1985, 3 months after they bought the building, the Justice Department told the Congress, "We changed our mind, we're not going to move," and they would sign a lease, this time with the Benders, the Bender family, friends of the Meeses, and so by June 85, they were to take hold of this building, and the government would lease from them. The environmental impact study was ordered from the General Services Administration. In the fall of 85, the Benders tried to get Ursula Meese on the payroll of some company. First, they tried WWDC radio station in Washington, then they settled for the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation. January the 1st, 1986, Mrs. Meese started to get her salary, guaranteed $40,000 for 3 years. In May of 86, 5 months later, this huge lease was signed with the Benders after she was assured her money, and the government promised them $50 million over the next 10 years. Now, this is the week of tax paying, so you might appreciate what is happening here. The lease that the government gave the Benders was 3 times what they paid the rent before, and they signed it even though the building was a health hazard. May 14th, 1987, the Benders signed a new lease on the condition that they clean up the air conditioning in 86. And 13 days after the lease was absolutely signed, they sold the building for $60 million and made a profit in 2 years of $22.7 million. What made their profit possible was that we taxpayers were paying 3 times the lease price before of $50 million, and with that extra 3 times what it was worth, they then sold it for $60 million, and they in turn made $22 million after assuring and signing an agreement that Mrs. Meese get a mere $120,000 out of all this. Now, Mr. Seymour Glanzer is an attorney for the Bender family. James Rocap is the attorney for the Meeses. He said the Attorney General was aware of the lease, that it was up, and that the air system was not cleaned out. And the Monterey Herald had a story that went this way. At the Immigration Service, Assistant Commissioner James Kennedy said it was his job to recommend to Commissioner Alan C. Nelson, this is the immigration offices, to Alan C. Nelson, whether to renew the lease on the Chester Arthur building that was owned by the Benders, or should they move as planned, as Congress had planned. The Immigration Service Commissioner went to his boss to see if they should move or renew the lease. And the article continues, if Alan Nelson, he's a personal friend of Edwin Meese's, they worked together in California, he's now head of the immigration. If he wanted to move, the General Services Administration would have found a different location. But Nelson, a long friend of Meese's from California, agreed to rent the building from Edwin and Ursula Meese's other friends, the Benders. And Ursula had just been promised $120 million for 3 years. So the decision was in the hands of Commissioner Alan C. Nelson, who's a long friend of the Meeses. And if he was not a friend, he could have taken the lease away, but he gave it to the Benders, and the Benders assured Mrs. Meese a job. Meese is surely the king of sleaze, and the implications here are horrendous, and the profit of $22.7 million in just 2 years tells one of the most shocking stories about Meese. A lot has been shocking, but this is simply horrendous. Now, when Meese was up for becoming Attorney General, there was an investigation in some of his scandals, and one of them had to do with, this is an article from the Wall Street Journal, March 14, 1984, Reagan picks head of General Services Administration, a man who was sued over practices in selling businesses. And I did a broadcast a long time ago about Mr. Courtemanche and lying about the money he had, the debts he had, the bonuses he took, the huge bonuses. Courtemanche didn't become head of GSA because of all the scandals, but he became the man in charge of Nancy Reagan's travel and public relations. But Reagan, in those early days, was stacking up the General Services and Office, and those were the people that account for renting these buildings. And there was another scandal with the General Services Administration. A man named Gerald Carman was leaving the General Services Administration, and Edwin Thomas was appointed to the GSA from the San Francisco Regional Office, and his brother Tad Thomas went on to Washington, D.C., and it was Tad Thomas who loaned Edwin Meese tax money for a Volkswagen van, and Mrs. Meese was loaned $16,000, remember, 3 days after the inauguration. So Meese went to their home in Washington from California with these big loans, and then Meese didn't declare the loan on his financial record. He didn't declare the profit or sale of stock he got from these people. And then Mrs. Meese made 3 times the amount of her investment that was put into the company of these various people, along with Dr. Earl Bryan, another friend who just bought United Press International. So the Meeses have a long record going back of doing these things, and they also stack the offices of the very people that make the decisions. Naturally, the appointments are there. So the big bonus went to the Bender family. The lease, the $50 million lease, went to them, and then 13 days later they sold it and made a $22 million profit in 2 years. And what made the building so profitable was that the Justice Department decided to stay there and not move, which they were going to do until Mrs. Meese got her guaranteed $120,000. Now, there was another article in the San Jose Mercury, how Meese advisor's life turned upside down. This is April the 11th. And again, this article has a lot of implications that link to other stories. This is the story of W. Franklyn Chinn, the money manager who has a reputation for convoluted stock deals and international money transfers. He's already been indicted for siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from WEDTEC Corporation, and Edwin Meese helped WEDTEC get a $32 million contract. Now, Chinn is described as the mystery man with a shadowy past, and the business contacts he's had with Meese go back just several years, 1985 to 87, but Chinn took $50,000 of investment made by Edwin Meese after he got a contract with him, and then started to spend $150,000 of Edwin Meese's money, which Meese didn't have. Within 18 months, he had made a 80% profit for Edwin Meese, up to $90,000, and according to this article, if Meese had made one phone call, he could have learned that Chinn was not a suitable investment advisor. Well, that's a ridiculous thing to write in the San Jose Mercury, because if he'd made a phone call, then Meese wouldn't have made that big profit. So, of course, he wasn't going to call. He made a profit up to $90,000. Why would he make a phone call and blow the profit? Edwin and Ursula Meese are into making profits. But the article goes on to say that until December 87, Chinn was never charged with a crime. He's involved with the WEDTEC story and as I say, the investments of Edwin Meese. But the story about Chinn goes back to his investments in Hong Kong. The article said that he has done business in Hong Kong, London, and Cayman Islands, where people avoid their U.S. income taxes. Again, being tax week, it's appropriate to talk about where Meese's advisor goes, his financial advisor, along with the income tax money we spend to give to the vendors to rent a building for 3 times what it was when the lease was signed before. Now, the IRS agents are looking into Chinn's work, fraudulent work, where he obtained at least $1.2 million from customers earlier using fake gold transactions and complicated maneuverings with bank accounts in Hong Kong and London. Now, Chinn had 2 wives, W. Franklyn Chinn. One wife, the first wife, is the director of a bank in the Cayman Islands where he keeps his money and deposits. Chinn was born in Shanghai, China. He came to California as a boy, and in 1960s he married Shadon El Shazley, Shazley. She's the director of the Cayman Island Bank, and her father is an Egyptian diplomat who over the years steered wealthy Middle Eastern clients to Chinn, an Egyptian diplomat. And I wondered when I read that if that Eatzco money of Richard Secord and Thomas Kleins and Eric von Marburg and that group that made all the money, millions of dollars off the Camp David Accords, had and does connect to the Egyptian wealth, the Middle East clients, and the Egyptian diplomat, who's the father of the first wife of Chinn, who uses her Cayman Island banks for deposits. Chinn later married again in 1980, and the host of his wedding was Charles Schwab, who had accounts of Bank of America for a while, who described himself as America's largest discount broker. Chinn went into financial relationship with WEDTEC as a consultant. He advised Edwin Meese, and he worked with E. Robert Wallach, the man who introduced Edwin Meese to WEDTEC and to Chinn. Chinn was a friend of Wallach's, Meese was a friend of his, and now Chinn and Wallach are indicted with the WEDTEC story. The important thing about this article that I thought was so interesting was the background of Chinn coming from Shanghai and possible links to Chiang Kai-shek group that became very prosperous at Taiwan, married to an Egyptian woman, a father of prominence in Egypt, and a woman who is a banker, a director of a bank in the Cayman Islands, and all of these Chinn's transactions for Meese, buying and selling the stock that he did, all was within the same day. At one time he spent $140,000 and the account only allowed for $50,000. So those are some little tidbits about Edwin Meese and his advisor and the SLEAZE operations that are expensive because the taxpayers, of course, foot the bill for these people, and they reap in millions of dollars. We'll take a break just long enough to turn this tape over, and then I'll continue with a little bit more about Mrs. Meese, the Multiple Sclerosis Association, and some of these foundations to raise money for medical purposes. This is Mae Brussell. It's the second half of tape number 854. April the 18th, 1988. Last week I was talking about white supremacist William Pierce of the National Alliance, formerly the American Nazi Party, headed by George Rockwell, who was his mentor, and the fact that Pierce had bought 100 shares of AT&T to try to get the powers that be to change the hiring records on having blacks because they are inferior, and he has a quoted goal of a worldwide Hitler-inspired regime. Pierce, having taught physics at the University of Oregon, had an Air Force contract, one or two, and worked for Pratt Whitney of United Technology. Now, there was an article about William Pierce and the American Nazi Party that was taken over by Pierce after Rockwell was murdered in 1967. This article came out in the Washington Post, December 25th, 1982. And in this article, it describes the party, the Nazi Party, that is going to change its name to the New Order. Well, that is the name that Richard Butler used with the Aryan nations, and they worked together. And this article from the Washington Post said that the Nazi Party will also be working, in addition to being proud of the National Space Program, they'll work on matters such as pollution and halting the nuclear weapon spread, and they will raise money to support research in cystic fibrosis and other diseases that primarily strike people of Northern European ancestry. And I wonder just how much money went from the National Alliance and the Nazi Party that was taken over after Rockwell was dead by William Pierce, how much they've put into, and are they interested in cystic fibrosis. The reason I bring this up is that here is an endeavor to put Mrs. Meese on the payroll of the multiple sclerosis group, and she was a volunteer and then gets paid to be on the board of that group. And I must remind you, and new listeners maybe don't know this, that Elmer Bobst, the long mentor to Richard Nixon, to his career, literally his godfather of politics, brought Waffen-SS Gestapo agent Otto von Borschwing to the United States, and before von Borschwing came to California to head up the TCI Corporation, whose subsidiary was bought by Albert Hakim to become the Stanford Technology Training Group. Before he was there, von Borschwing worked for Elmer Bobst in the American Cancer Society and assisted him on medical trips or did work in the medical-related business. And, of course, Otto von Borschwing was very much part of the Iron Guard, of sending people to their death, the Romanian Iron Guard, and working with the Gestapo, a long member of Heinrich Himmler's Gestapo, who came to work in this country with Elmer Bobst. And Elmer Bobst became the first lay citizen after World War II to head the American Cancer Society that was formerly headed by doctors. And on the board, he immediately put William Donovan, who was the head of the OSS during World War II. And the OSS were dealing with Nazis such as Reinhard Gehlen and von Borschwing before the war was even over. So the Nazis have a history of being involved in medical situations, experimentations, and also working in this country along those lines. So when I read about the New Order wanting to assist research in cystic fibrosis and other diseases, I wonder really how far that goes. Now, this article in the Washington Post on the Arlington Nazis is written by Leah Latimer, and the gist of the article is that the Nazi Party is moving away from Arlington, Virginia, where they were located, and that they're breaking up, and that after the death of George Lincoln Rockwell, who incidentally was an official in the Navy, he was an officer in the Navy and a graduate of Brown University. He wasn't just some kooky Nazi. He was linked to our military establishment and to a college where a lot of the hierarchy of intelligence goes, such as E. Howard Hunt. But the article about the plans to leave Arlington are quotations and research of John Reese, the gentleman who was involved in putting computers from the Los Angeles Police Department into Western goals. John Reese is the person putting down the importance of the Nazi movement in 1982, when Richard Butler and the Aryan nations and the Order were getting new muscles and new links to Germany, to Nazis in Germany. And John Reese is the person quoted in these articles to play down the importance of the Nazis in America. This article, as I say, from the Washington Post said that the American Nazi Party is moving to the Midwest and their headquarters state in the East, that they changed their name to the National Socialist White People's Party, and of course William Pierce took over when Rockwell died. John Reese doesn't mention that. It explains that this former naval officer, George Lincoln Rockwell, was shot, and then John Reese, quoted here, said that the Nazi group probably had 50 or 60 members, according to John Reese, the author of a newsletter. Now, the truth is that the Nazi Party by 1982 was recruiting the Minutemen. The Minutemen are now recruiting former and retired CIA, and John Reese was putting down a situation that mushroomed and grew and made it sound like there were only 50 members. And Meese works with Daniel Graham, formerly the Defense Intelligence Agency, who shares offices with Fritz Kramer, who I believe is the Waffen-SS Fritz Kramer, a member of the same organization as Otto von Borschwing. And so John Reese becomes the expert. And then the article continues, I think if we said it had 10 members today, it would be an exaggeration. Now, that's 1982 when the Klan, the Nazis, Richard Butler, a former scientist from Lockheed that worked for the government defense, goes up to Idaho and has the Aryan nations up there, and John Reese, who always cries communist under every log and tree, reverses it here and tells in the Washington Post that there's only 10 members in the Nazi Party, and he's putting down the importance of William Pierce, who he doesn't mention. He mentions the late Rockwell, as I said, but nobody else. And then the article goes on to say that the group would be active, as I mentioned, raising money for cystic fibrosis, and I think that would cause a few eyes to wonder, well, how much are these people into the medical experiments in this country? Now, Edwin Meese was down in Bolivia this past week, and the newspaper articles had different titles. The LA Times had a story, Meese stresses the Bolivian role in the drug war. And it's very important to remember, and I might have mentioned it many times before, as long as Bolivia was under the care of the cocaine kings of the establishment of Colonel Luis Arce Gomez, the former Interior Minister, under Klaus Barbie, the cocaine flowed into this country, and Klaus Barbie worked with the American authorities and the CIA. As soon as Gomez was kicked out of office and the government was changed in 1982, and then the profits were out of the cocaine going into a Democratic Party and not a fascist party, then the administration said we have to stop the cocaine in Bolivia, but they didn't mind it before. March 19th, 1981, I have a news story. Colonel Luis Arce, R.K., it's pronounced Gomez, the Interior Minister of Bolivia, met with advisors to Ronald Reagan last December to discuss possible ways to cut the flow of cocaine from Bolivia. He discussed it and met with them, but according to the DEA reports, the Colonel's Interior Ministry was issuing permits for growers in Bolivia to produce cocaine, and the growers would pay $40 tax on each bale of cocoa leaf. Colonel Arce is said to have taken a personal cut of $10 per bale. His annual income was $1.5 million at least, and the DEA told Latin American Weekly Report that the Bolivian government is entrenched in Bolivia's coke production. So this was in the news reports going back to 1981 when Mr. Arce Gomez was meeting with Ronald Reagan's group. Covert Action, November 25th, winter edition, 1986, has a long article on cocaine, Klaus Barbie, Bolivia, and Stefano Delle, Chiaie, the terrorist that worked down in Bolivia and South America with the cocaine group, setting up death squads. And there's a picture in this issue of this General Meese, Garcia Meese with Bohai Pak of the Moonies, and the Moonies were very close to the cocaine operation in Bolivia. Reverend Moon and Bohai Pak and Klaus Barbie had a very close relationship, as did the Reagan administration from the time it came into power. And, of course, the Reagan administration entertained Mr. Luis Arce Gomez in 1984 in Dallas, Texas, when Reagan was nominated again to be President of the United States. Richard Allen and a team of Americans entertained him, and their problem then was how to cut off the money from Bolivia, the cocaine money, because the profits now would get into a democratic society, as I say, As long as the money's in the hands of the fascists, it's okay. The New York Times, October 17th, 1982, has this story, Palmy Days Over for Nazi in Bolivia. And it tells about Klaus Barbie and his frequent meetings with Colonel R.K. Gomez, who he in turn goes up to see Ronald Reagan in Washington, and that Mr. Klaus Barbie was going to have a hard time now, and indeed he did, as soon as the government changed hands. But here is Edwin Meese down in Bolivia finding ways to stop the cocaine from growing, and he was very much part with Ronald Reagan of working with those very same people until Bolivia changed their government. Now, in terms of elections, election provocateurs, and thinking of the Reichstag fire, there's a whole lot of terrorism that took place this past week and a half, and I'm going to put it in chronological order, and I think you should too. Cut the articles, because what we're going to get, and it gives George Bush a chance now to be exposed in the media, where he sat behind before as the great leader fighting terrorism. Of course, he was down in the Philippines with Marcos, thanking them for their great democracy at one point, ridiculed for it. But the terrorism that's escalating now is what I call pre-election terrorism. In 1986, when Reagan wanted to control Congress, there was a Pakistan hijacking one day. One day later, there was a synagogue that was blown apart in Turkey with many Jews killed praying in the synagogue. None of those were ever solved. And then the third day after those two terrorisms, I remarked on World Watchers that Ronald Reagan left his eagle's nest in Santa Barbara and went to Santa Barbara to Los Angeles to start campaigning for Ed Chow. Well, the terrorism didn't work, but it does leave the general sense of what will a newcomer do who can't handle international affairs like Mr. Dukakis or Jesse Jackson. It takes a man of experience such as George Bush, so the ideas will soon get into people's heads, and subtly through various programs and talk shows, Bush will be on all the time talking about drugs in Bolivia or hijackers. And this we saw just in the past 2 weeks, actually April the 7th, there was a hijacking where the hijackers wanted the release of 17 in Kuwait. This is the same group that Albert Hakim and Oliver North and Gorbanov were arranging the release for, and the hijacking story has been in the news all week. Then on the 15th of April, explosion rips the hull of U.S. Navy frigate in Persian Gulf, and 10 were hurt. So that was another terrorism act. There was the hijacking the week before, and then the explosion on the U.S. frigate. Of course, nobody is punished as yet, because these are agent provocateur incidences that just take a lot of headlines. Then also on the 15th, a car bomb kills an American at a Naples club, and all of a sudden the media and the powers that be are looking for the Japanese Red Army. And out of nowhere, a long time gone is the Japanese Red Army. They'll soon be calling for Carlos, another provocateur. And in between, the hijackers are at Cyprus leaving Beirut, and then the hijackers are in Algiers and get some more weapons, and that's in the news. And then on the 16th of April, Japanese terrorists suspected, Japanese Red Army, it comes out again, for bombing the USO in Italy. Then another terrorist headline comes. Millions of dollars, Gaddafi giving aid to Noriega in Panama. Bush reveals. Now, these little things used to be revealed by the National Security Council, by the Secretary of State, by the Secretary of Defense, but candidate Bush is right in there giving his little lies, such as saying that Gaddafi bombed the Berlin disco. So Bush is getting the headlines with this kind of talk. And then on April the 17th, new wave of terror. Italian senator killed by the Red Brigades. So what we have in the past week are the Red Brigades, the Japanese Red Army, the United States USO hit, the U.S. freighter, the frigate hit in the Persian Gulf. So just start adding up these little terrorisms and see how they build to a crescendo. These situations go bananas until we have an election. Then they're quiet for 2 to 4 years until another election period comes up. I just don't know who has the time or money to investigate each individual case, but it all adds up to a lot of terrorism at a time when people go to vote, and that's the important point about the actions, to get people upset about this and to send in somebody that they know has had a lot of experience, like George Bush. Now, I did several broadcasts on the company OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and they had two tangled relationships that I went into detail. One involved Edwin Meese and, again, his friend E. Robert Wallach, who's his attorney for Meese, who takes care of his finances. And it has to do with the OPIC Corporation involved in the Iraq pipeline. And the company, OPIC, was to insure the pipeline, but they were going to pay Shimon Peres a fat fee not to blow it up. Israel wouldn't blow it up. And Attorney Wallach already made $1 million attorney fees, and he got Edwin Meese to put $60,000 into this affair. And they would be protected by OPIC's an insurance private investment corporation to be assured that the pipeline wouldn't be blown up. And on the other hand, I mentioned the Overseas Private Investment Corporation was also busy over in Costa Rica with John Hall. Besides Wallach making $1 million, Hall got a $375,000 loan that can't be accounted for, and Robert Owen, formerly of Robert Keith Gray Associates, working with Oliver North, was the man instrumental to passing the money down to John Hall's ranch. Hall gets also $800 a month from the CIA for his bodyguards, and I talked about that company working not only in the Middle East with the Iraq pipeline, but down in Costa Rica, that very controversial location of John Hall. Now, I've mentioned before that the Robert Owen public relations firm, not Robert Owen, the Robert Gray public relations firm, where Owen came out of to do the dirty work with the Contras down there in Central America, is a public relations firm that took over at the time that Mullen Associates had to go into the decline and not be visible. Mullen was the office where the Watergate defendants were paid. They were paid out of that office. Robert Gray was a very active participant in the Republican activities parties, and he was the director, under Director George Bush of the CIA. Robert Gray had worked with Bobby Inman and Henry Kissinger and Edwin Wilson, and Robert Gray's public relations office opened and took over from a Mullen Associates. As I say, Mullen was exposed. Now, I came across an article this past week, cleaning out some files, Salt Lake Tribune, December the 7th, 1975. And what the article is about is the formation of that insurance company, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the one involved with the profits that Ed Meese would get with his friend Wallach and Bechtel would bill, and also the profits John Hall would get. And I came across an article, Salt Lake Tribune, 1975, and the gist of the article is that Wallace F. Bennett, he's the father of Robert Bennett, who ran the Robert Mullen offices for E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, and Frank Sturgis, a gentleman named in the Christic Affidavit, and for others. The Bennett office was run by Robert Mullen in Washington, and it was a front for the CIA. And Wallace Bennett, who ran this office, after Watergate was over, became a board member of OPIC, the new company that is involved with the pipeline and with John Hall. Was formed in 1975. The Watergate story was winding down after 1974-75, and OPIC was formed. And who was on the board of OPIC but Wallace Bennett, the father of Robert Bennett, who ran the Mullen Company for the CIA for the entire Watergate saga. And Wallace Bennett was interviewed in the Salt Lake Tribune. He said it's challenging to be a director of the new Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is a government agency created by Congress to ensure U.S. investments overseas. And he tells about his 24 years in the Senate, and it was his son that ran the Watergate operations out of the office in Washington, D.C., and he described how OPIC would guarantee protection for companies such as Dow Chemical and for petrochemical plants in South Korea and in Brazil, which was very much a military dictatorship at the time. And Mr. Wallace Bennett was one of the main directors, new directors of this company that was formed, and this company was instrumental, as I say, in very much of the Iran-Contra affair. And so it reminded me of a material I had at the time of the Watergate hearings, how Mr. Bennett's son was indeed running the offices of the Mullen Associates set up by the CIA, and then the Mullen in turn became Robert Gray's offices, and then Robert Gray hired Robert Owen, and Owen went on to be the dispenser of funds down there in Central America. So the continuation of Watergate is important in the continuity of Wallace Bennett and Robert Bennett, and how the father and son were working with OPIC and also with the Watergate persons who later could move their entire operation over to Robert Gray's offices, which they did. Now, I just want to mention one other subject. I'm covering a lot of material on this tape, but this has to do with disinformation. George Bush, as the great CIA director, communicator, and the people he works with, and how lies are put out that later are proven to be just lies, nothing else, and we can look back and see what kind of shenanigans these dirty tricksters use and have used to get into office and to continue their Cold War lies that are later proven to be lies. I'm referring now to an article by Roger Fontaine, published July the 11th, 1984, in the Washington Times, published by Reverend Moon, the close friend of the Bolivian dictators and Klaus Barbie and his associates. The article is regarding the shooting of Eden Pastora, which is the subject of the Christic Institute suit, and the title of the article is Clues Link Managua to Eden Pastora's Life. And the gist of the article, it's a long article, is that the Nicaraguan government, through probably a Basque agent, were the ones that shot Eden Pastora, that the shooting was done by Cuba, by Fidel Castro, and Nicaragua, which we know isn't true, and that a Basque gentleman, a Marxist-Leninist since 1970, was working with the Soviet Union and Moscow's client states, as well as with other terrorists such as the Irish Republican Army and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And the article, as I say, was written by Roger Fontaine, large, long article with big black letters on the shooting of Pastora by the Marxist-Leninists and those people out of Cuba. And, of course, Nicaragua was saying it was a CIA explosion. The plastics came from the CIA, which turned out to be true. But the gist of the article was to blame the communist Cuba and Ortega for trying to kill Eden Pastora, written by Roger Fontaine. And then I have other articles on the Cartergate papers that were stolen when Ronald Reagan wanted to become president, and all of his future appointees were very busy helping him by stealing Jimmy Carter's papers. And this article, July 8th, 1983, goes on to say two men were blaming each other for the Carter papers being stolen, one a Mr. Halper and the other one Mr. Garrick. And the article says Halper, 37, was in charge of foreign policy issues for George Bush's campaign. In 1980, he joined the Reagan campaign after Bush was named as Reagan's running mate. He's the son of Raymond Klein, formerly high official of the CIA. He's also a close associate of Roger Fontaine, who worked in the Bush campaign and now works on Central American issues for William Clark, Reagan's assistant for national security. So Roger Fontaine is close to the people who stole the papers that Ronald Reagan used to brief him for a debate with Jimmy Carter. Roger Fontaine worked for George Bush on the Bush campaign. Roger Fontaine worked with William Clark on the Central American issues. So when Mr. Eden Pastora was almost killed and 8 others were killed with the La Panca bombing, it is the disinformation of the George Bush people working closely with Bush, with Central American William Clark, that came out with that large story that Eden Pastora was killed by a Basque terrorist sent by Ortega and Fidel Castro, a Marxist-Leninist. Now, the history is that without the Christic Institute, we wouldn't know who was behind La Panca bombing. It was Danny Chinn and his group that helped Martha Honey, a person who was at the bombing and injured, and Tony Abergan, her husband. And the truth of the bombing is going to be coming out in the lawsuit that the Christic Institute has filed. But in the meanwhile, there isn't always a Danny Chinn to follow up on these stories, and every day we are fed lies and disinformation about who was doing the terrorism, who was doing the bombing. And that's why I say the stories of the Pakistan bombing or the Turkey shootout at the synagogue, those were never solved. They didn't even bother to lie. And now all these terrorist incidents that are happening in the Gulf and with the Red Brigades in Italy and the Japanese Red Army in Italy and all these terrorist things, those again can be the same kind of National Security Council, CIA, Defense Department lies and conclusions, and people have to just swallow those cases because individually, as I say, there aren't enough Danny Sheehan's to do the matter. But in this case, I thought it was interesting that the blatant lies can be linked again to George Bush, the former CIA director, and I know he will run his campaign with the same kind of blatant lies he used before, and he also, by being selected as the vice president, benefited if Reagan could have a debate with Jimmy Carter and use the stolen papers. So the terrorism that's coming down and the lies and disinformation keep coming back to the encampment around CIA Director George Bush, and that's another reason I say we can expect a lot of bombing of Marxists, Leninists, and let's bring on Carlos. That's the only thing left to bring out, and then they can tangle them for a long time to come. There was that shootout in Italy, as I say, where a politician was killed this weekend, and they are blaming the Italian Red Brigades. Now, a well-known prisoner who only was in prison a few days or a month is out of prison. His name is Licio Gelli, and an article in the paper just Sunday said, freed prisoner calls on judge, Milan, Italy. The alleged mastermind of two of Italy's most sensational post-war scandals made a courtesy call on the judge who had him released from jail. He was in Switzerland before and had to pay to get out of jail, so this time he is out thanks to the judge. I wanted to thank the magistrate who granted me the liberty, who's given me back my life, said Licio Gelli. Antonio Pisa ordered the release Monday in the Parma prison of Licio Gelli because of his health. This is the same judge who charged Gelli with fraudulent bankruptcy in 1982 following the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, $1.2 billion in Panama dummy fronts has never been found, and also he was charged for violence of the he's in Italy for the Bologna bombing where 85 people were killed, and goodness knows the list of injured is large and it changes depending which article you read, but many people were injured. So this judge has let him out of jail, and maybe he'll leave the country like he did before, and he has the gracious consent that he suffered enough, I guess, in jail. Now, Danny Sheehan was in Santa Cruz a few weeks ago. A lot of you subscribers have taken note of that. Some of you were there when he spoke, but those of you on the East Coast or North or South or West don't get access to some of the things Danny Sheehan says. They're certainly not covered in the major newspapers, and a small newspaper, actually the Comic News up in Santa Cruz, had an article about an interview with Danny Sheehan, and it's titled, Sheehan Takes on George Bush, and of course that doesn't make the headlines, would it? And I don't have time to go into much of this. I'll just quickly say that Danny Sheehan says he has facts implicating, among others, George Bush in a series of covert activities stopping nothing short of murder. His most explosive charge, described only at a reception, links Bush to the 1976 murder of the ex-Chilean ambassador to the United States under deposed Chilean socialist President Salvador Allende. That was Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat. And of course, I've referred to Killer Bush for years because there is ample evidence, and I'm not Danny Sheehan, that George Bush was behind the murder of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat right there in Washington, D.C., and also for blowing up Air Cuba, the Air Cubana airline where 78 athletes, Cuban athletes, were murdered. I will get back more. I do a lot on Killer Bush from time to time, but I think it's interesting that Danny Sheehan is talking about George Bush and evidence of his being a murderer, and it is indeed a tragedy that these things don't make McNeil Lair, Crossfire, Nightline. The real tragedy is that these known killers and planners of murders keep repeating the privilege of getting into office as president and the press does not pursue these things the way they should be doing them. Well, my time is up, so that is enough news for this week. There's a lot more already, and for next week, and it hasn't even started. There's so much to get caught up. But this is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week, combing those newspapers for some of these little gems. So take care, and I'll be back with you next week.